Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Blackbaud, the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. With their cloud solution for higher education, Blackbaud connects thousands of campuses worldwide. Visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn how they can help your institution deliver a better experience. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our special guest today is Dr. Gordon Gee, president of West Virginia University. Dr. Gee is an academic's academic. He's held more university presidencies than any other American, 7 of them to be exact, at 5 different institutions. All of them R1 type institutions. Who's better to speak about governance than Dr. Gee, who's worked with multiple boards both in the public and in private institutions?
Gordon, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here.
Oh, Drum, I enjoyed our last conversation so much, I kept lobbying you to get back on the show.
Well, you didn't have to lobby much. I think it was very mutual in that respect. So it's been about 2 months. A lot of things have been going down in higher ed, and especially at West Virginia. Why don't you bring me up to date on, things that have happened since we spoke last?
Well, sure. I think that, as you know, when we spoke, we were just really in the midst of the shutdown, the national shutdown, the hammer as I call it. Now we're into the dance, which is how do we open up? And I think that is exactly where we are. We just announced yesterday a number of things. We are going to open our campus, but we're going to test everyone. We're going to require everyone to wear masks while they're on campus. We're going to continue to monitor social distancing, a variety of other things, which require us to dramatically change the configuration of our classrooms. We're going to have to move to a hybrid flex model, which means that a large number of our courses will be in person, but a certain number of our courses will still be online, even though the students are here. And we may even go back and forth between online and in person. So all those protocols are very expensive, very dramatic, but I think that they are important for us to get people comfortable. On the one side, people comfortable about sending their children to the university. On the other hand, making certain that our faculty, staff, and students are comfortable and well taken care of in terms of the coronavirus, which is still with us. It will be with us forever. As I think I told you maybe last time that I view this as one of those long-term issues that we just have to deal with. 88,000 people died of influenza this year, and most of them had the flu shot. 50,000 people died in car wrecks. We all have driver's license. So we have to think about this now from a university perspective as how do we deal with reality, and how do we make certain that reality becomes a way of life for us in a positive way.
Absolutely. And as we've said before, this is really accelerating the needed changes in higher ed by a decade or more. And we should not be wasting a good crisis.
No, absolutely not. But as I point out, I'm a Luddite, and here you and I are talking on this instance on Zoom. And, if you'd have told me 3 months ago that I would be doing this, I would have thought that you were smoking something in Albuquerque. But for me, it's been a revelation. Of course, I love students, I love faculty, I love staff, I love the human contact. And what I'm discovering is the fact that I'm much more efficient. Whether or not I'm more effective will remain to be seen. But so what happens is my assistant schedules me for every half hour, and so it used to be when someone would come into my office that they would come in, they would sit down with me, we'd have a nice chat, and I would do the business, and then when I left, I'd walk them out, and we'd have a nice chat. Now, as I tell everyone, I just do my business, and I don't need to be nice to anyone. We just get it done, which is not fun necessarily, but hopefully this will pass. But I do think, and as we talked to the last time, the acceleration from 10 years ago to 10 months, I think is really clear, because technology has to be our friend, but in this instance, it has to also be very much a part of who we are and what we are. We have to learn from this. We have to learn a different dynamic than we have been used to, and in many ways that people want to maintain in higher education.
Well, it's kind of interesting, and a thought came to mind is we've got so many of these digital natives, millennials, Gen Y, Gen Z, who are coming up, and they are so, technology is the way they do things. I mean, they would much rather be in front of the television with an Xbox or something like that. And now we're having to move over into their medium where they're most comfortable.
Yeah, my 7-year-old identical twin granddaughters fix my devices when they're not working. I mean, that's where it is. And I'm 70 years older than them, and they're fixing my devices. But that's because they're native. That's because they understand it. Because I think it's in their DNA in many ways. I think that this notion, I think intuitively, at least people my age have kind of this fear of technology. I mean, we love it. We all have our smartphones. We all have our other things. But guess what? We still have that fear. So it is a changing environment, and I have to get used to it. But I also, as university president, I have to lead, not follow. So those are the issues that we're wrestling with right now.
Well, I understand, and it's a great segue into talking about what we were going to discuss today, which is governance. Technology has changed higher education in huge ways over the last 20 years, but governance also has been changing significantly, especially in the coronavirus era right now. So what are some of the changes that you've seen historically?
Well, 40 years as university president. When I first became a president, I've seen almost every variation on governance. Let me just kind of give a quick governance overview, if I can, if you have time with that. Because when I became president of West Virginia University the first time, it was a system governance board. I mean, they had a board of regents, and they would have local advisory boards. But it was in Charleston, and I was here in Morgantown. I moved to the University of Colorado, which had elected regents. And very often I joke about the fact that I had one regent run against the university, saying that he was running in order to get rid of all the communists in Boulder, and he won.
The People's Republic of Boulder.
Yes, all the communists disappeared. I guess I have no idea. I mean, it was one of those things. And then moving to Ohio State, which has a gubernatorially appointed board. Brown had 61 members of its board. Vanderbilt had 41 members, back to Ohio State again, about 17, 18 members. And then West Virginia now has its own board, and rightfully so. But in each of those, what I've learned is the fact that board dynamics are very important, and leadership of the board is very important, and making certain you do not have factions on the board. The issue is one of communication from the president. So many of my colleague presidents kind of had this view about their boards is that, bring them in, take them to a football game, treat them to a good meal, and get them the hell out of town. It's sort of like the mushroom approach to academic growth. My instance is the fact that I want them to be my partner, and so I want to communicate as much and as often as I possibly can. In fact, with the West Virginia board, I try to communicate in so many different ways on an ongoing basis, writing them notes, doing a variety of things, observations, everything I possibly can, because I think that if you can create a partnership with your board, you're much better. Now, the dynamics of change, which we're talking about, is the fact that boards have become much more engaged in the minutiae of the university, if I can say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
The line between management and governance has gotten very murky.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a real challenge for both the boards and for the university. And how we deal with that requires an immense amount of conversation with the board, and also making certain that any board understands what your views are. I was interviewed by the Chronicle of Higher Education the other day, and they asked me about about bureaucracy. And I said, well, there are 4 levels of bureaucracy that we deal with as a public university president. One is the federal government, which is unbelievably bureaucratic. The second, of course, is the state government. And that's a natural level of bureaucracy you'd expect. The third is board bureaucracy. And by that, I mean, and I'm pleased to be in West Virginia. And I'm not saying this just because I'm here, but we have a very good structure whereby we don't get asked immediately do things just out of the blue, which people don't understand will take tremendous amounts of time, or add lawyers here, add folks there. It's a very congenial way to deal. But in my other boards, I'll use Ohio State when I was there both times. People say, well, why don't you solve the cure for, create the cure for cancer and see if you can't bring it back to the board? Well, that does take resources. That does take time. And
Sure.
And it's that issue. And then also everyone has sort of their own pet project and how you deal with that. So over time, those lines have gotten very murky. I think in the age of the coronavirus, I think it's become even more intense in terms of board relationships. I point out that I think that university presidents' heads are very lightly on their shoulders. By that I mean, there's a lot of oversight. There's a lot of second guessing. There's a lot of why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And there are a lot of people who are very tenuous in terms of their positions. And I understand being tenuous. That's one of the reasons I've had to move so many times myself. Is just ahead of the sheriff or ahead of the board. One of the two things, So it's a challenging time to be a university president, because also with your boards, they tend to be more externally oriented, more business oriented, a variety of other things. And then you have the issue of the internal constituencies, who tend to be much more inside this academic bubble. They tend to be more political and less realistic in many ways, I think. And so how one balances that, I tell everyone the university president has to be very Janus-faced. To the external world, the university's going to hell in a handbasket, and we got to do this, we got to do that, give us more money. And to the internal world, it's Cinderella time, And so how we cross-pollinate and get some realism in both of those discussions, I think, is enormously important.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because as you're talking about the boards and more, I don't want to say interactive with the president, micromanaging is kind of what comes to mind. I have this favorite cartoon, which I'm putting up on the screen for you. You see the boss up there with the magnifying glass looking down, and the caption says, I really hate it when he micromanages.
That's worthy. I'll have you send me that one, my friend.
Absolutely. Because, as we've talked about before, governance is one of the areas that I work in. And I've seen, and I'm sure you'll talk to this, I've seen a huge difference. It's like you said for second-time university presidents. When you've seen one university, you've seen one university. Well, when you've seen one board, you've seen one board. And it's very difficult to group them by public boards versus private boards. So some of your thoughts on those, please.
Well, the public boards are very intense. You may meet every month or every other month or whatever like that. I mean, at Brown, I think we met 2 times a year. At Vanderbilt, I think we met 3 times a year. You would have an executive committee, and they would be, the chairman, the vice chairman, chairman of finance, et cetera, and they would meet more often. But private university boards tend to be cheerleaders, tend to be funders, tend to be people who can make an extraordinary contribution to the university in time, talent, treasure, whatever. Public university boards, because they're politically appointed, very often have political agendas of either that governor or of if they're elected, which I think is the worst form of governance. Whatever it is, there's a much broader political tone and the political agenda to a public board, and that makes it so that you have to deal with circumstances that are really beyond your control, but still are in the boardroom with your governing board. And so it's a very tender line you walk very often in the public universities.
Yeah. And as a university president, if there's a dysfunctional board, that ends up making your job more difficult. But at the same time, as a board, they are supposed to be oversight for the university. So it's a very difficult balancing act, I would assume.
It is very difficult, and a dysfunctional board. And I know a number of my colleagues that I've talked to over time. I've gone and spoken with boards on behalf of presidents. You can always be an instant expert if you come in from somewhere else, as you know what I mean, and then you go back and then you're engaged with reality again. But dysfunctional boards are the worst thing in the world, because then it's about infighting. It's about who has the access to power, who do you want to talk to as a president? Can you get a straight answer? A variety of other things. I'm really blessed to have a board right now where I know how to get a straight answer, and they give me a straight answer, and we have really healthy conversations. And so on the end of my life as university president, that's really pleasant. But very often I've had hand-to-hand combat. I'll just use Ohio State again. I really in my first tenure, I really wanted to raise admission standards for the university, get out of open admission. And I had a lot of people say, well, you're moving away from the land grant mission. What about these kids who just want to come to the university? It used to be that the first 15,000 or whatever could come, and then we'd eventually, of course, we'd look to the right and look to the left, and a number of them disappeared. My second time around, I really wanted to put a lot of emphasis on the undergraduate environment and the quality of the undergraduate educational experience, and had a lot of conflict about that. Why are you putting money into students? They're going to come. So why don't you put it more into research, or into building medical centers, and all of that kind of Sturm and Drang. And so you, as university president, have to always have a polar star which says this is where we want to do, and you have to convince people. I've always thought about a university presidency. There's a very strong political component to it. Once you make a decision, you have to go out and convince people. You have to campaign for that decision with your board, with the faculty, with the staff, with the students. Everyone knows how to run the university better than I do in any institution, and they tell me about it all the time. And everyone wants to have a plebiscite. They want to have their particular view taken care of. I'm not the president of General Motors. I can't say I'm going to close the Lordstown plant and close. I can't say I'm going to shut down the Department of X, and it happens. I mean, it is. Then you have to really convince people about the rectitude of your decision. So it's decision making with a lot of balancing that goes on in terms of conversations.
Absolutely. And it's one of those statements that people support what they help create.
Exactly.
And so if you can bring them on board early on in the process, it really mitigates a lot of resistance.
Oh, you have to. I mean, again, and that's good policy anyway. There are so many people in this university who are so much wiser than I am, smarter than I am, who understand the nature of the research enterprise, who understand the nature of what is happening in terms of neurosurgery, a variety of other things. I can't tell them what to do, but I can try to be a facilitator. And that, I think, is where sometimes this grind with the board comes. As you're trying to facilitate, people just say, well, just make it happen, as if there's some kind of a magic wand there. And I would love to just make it happen, except I think that being king for a day really does not work in this kind of an environment.
No, and it typically doesn't, because you've got so many smart people. They know they're smart. They think they're smarter than you, and you have to bring them along almost as if you're going to make this thing their idea and get the buy-in, and that's tiring.
Yeah, well, it is tiring. It's very exhausting. Very often in boards, there are one or two people in every board who believe that they're much smarter than you are and know exactly how to run the institution, and how you cajole them, how you convince them, how you make certain that they don't dominate the agenda, how you make certain you don't make the agenda conducive to what they're doing is a trick. At the same time, it's also important as you work with board leadership to make certain you have a board leaders who will discipline people when they move outside of the lines of good board behavior. And I think that is one of the real challenges that we face right now, is that yin and yang between the president and the board chair to make certain that you keep in the middle of the road.
That was the next thing I really wanted to talk about, is that relationship between the president and the board chair should be a very special relationship to where everything can be shared back and forth, and you guys form you're almost joined at the hip. It's such a strong team, or it should be.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've always thought that university presidents and provosts are joined at the hip. I also think the very same thing with university presidents and their board chair. And that means you need to trust each other. You can tell each other what you want to say. I've on occasion over the 4 years I've had board chairs who love to talk to the press or a variety of other things, and so it becomes much more difficult to engage in that kind of intimate relationship that is absolutely essential for making the university a better place and making governance work in the best sense of it.
Mm-hmm. What is the optimum size board that you have seen?
Some university presidents would say 0. No, cut that one out. No. I think that the optimal size is between probably about 15 and 20. You want it large enough so you have diverse views. You want it small enough so that you don't have an army. And I think that view, that's important. On our own board, we have 2 faculty members and 1 staff member and 1 student. And they're regular members of our board. And I value having them on the board. I wasn't certain when the first time I got a student on the board at Ohio State during my first tenure, whether or not that was a good idea. But I now believe that it's important to have those views from our faculty, our staff, and our students as part of that conversation. The one thing that I always say to our faculty, our staff member, our student, is the fact that you are not a constituent representative. You come with a point of view, but you're not simply there to lobby on behalf of the faculty or the students. You're there to bring that particular perspective that only you can bring. And that is always difficult, to make sure that they rise to a higher order, if you know what I mean.
I certainly do. And it's important to have that different perspective, because here you've got a bunch of men and women who are anywhere between 45 and 75 on your board. You generally don't have them any younger than that other than students. And their time at college was much different than what is going on right now.
Everyone wants to remember old Siwash the way that it was, But I will say this about our students, they come to the institution, and in the middle of it, you change something. You change the way you have a rock concert or something. Oh my gosh, the world is just blown up, and you can't do that to us. And then 2 years down the line, the new change, everyone says, well, that's the long time tradition of the university, because students have a very short memory. They're only there for 4 or 5 years, and I hope. And, if they're not graduating, I got a very serious problem with parents. But saying that is a real challenge about people wanting the university to be the way that it was. I would love to be able to destroy everyone's rearview mirror. If we're in a car called the university, if I could get rid of every rearview mirror, it would be such a much different way to think about how we manage ourselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I always say to everyone, the most disconcerting question that I always receive as university president is when I say, well, why are we doing this? They say, well, that's the way we always did things here,
Yes.
as if God or Jerry West or someone foreordained it. And we cannot think that way. It's so antithetical, because change, and now in today's world, we're either going to be the architects of change or its victims,
Yes.
And sacred cows make the best hamburgers, and people just need to understand.
I'm going to borrow that one, Gordon. Well, I think I'd mentioned to you before that I was a member of the National Association of Corporate Directors,
Yes.
and they have what they call a blue ribbon commission, and they do studies this year. And the one that they did this last year was the new mandate for the board leaders. And they looked at really 5 different things. And this is all about change. The mega trends, they're deeply connected, they're intensifying over time. Regulation, competition, climate change, technology, and now the pandemic, brings that in as well. The pace and the scale of change is moving so much more, and board leaders must transform how the board composed, operates, and transacts with the business and holds itself accountable. All of these things are so critical, and it's almost as if higher ed has been in its own bubble for so many years, and boards are now starting to see, oh my gosh, we've got to change to keep up with times.
Yeah, it really is. It's just a crazy time with all of this. But those are really good points. I've sat on a number of corporate boards, large corporations, and privileged to do so. And I know that notion of corporate responsibility as board members and university board are coming closer together because they're moving toward each other.
Yes.
Not that a university board is becoming more corporate or that a corporate board is becoming more like a university board, but because the fact that there's a lot of commonalities in terms of what is happening now. And I think that that's critically important to understand. So.
Well, you're absolutely right. The nonprofit and the for-profit boards are coming much, much closer together. And a lot of the good corporate governance is really making its way into higher ed. When we go in and work with boards, we will use a skills matrix to determine what the necessary skills are for board members, bring on the recruiting, all of that stuff.
And that's very critical because, if you think about a university, universities are one of the most complex organizations. If you think about us as a corporation, we're a very complex organization because we don't make cars, we don't make widgets, we make ideas, and we also have large entertainment enterprises called football. We have large hotels called residence halls. We have huge restaurants. We have zebrafish and mice because we're experimenting on them.
Mm-hmm.
We have all of these kind of things, and I think that even for someone who comes from a complex world, the complexity of university sometimes is just a little bit overwhelming to them.
It is. And for a board member to be able to understand the various aspects, I know there's a big thing about term limits, and I personally am for term limits on boards, but there is a historical knowledge that is important on how an organization has run and should run, and the learning curve for a higher ed board member is as steep as any other board they sit on, if not more so.
Yeah, absolutely. And so their terms should not be too long. Their terms should not be too short. And I like actually the system we have here. They're appointed for a 4-year term and then can be reappointed for a 4-year term. At Ohio State, they were appointed for a 9-year term. So if you get someone who was not really worthy of the university in some way, then you have to deal with it. But on the other hand, I think 8 or 9 years is entirely appropriate because it takes a good deal of time for people to get really acclimated to the culture, the contrary nature of university, because they are contrarians, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
and also the culture and possibilities of the institution, in addition to all of the kinds of things that happen just on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's an incredibly complex beast, and as much as we would like to simplify it on certain things, you really can't. It's very difficult to do that.
You cannot. No, you cannot. And if you try to simplify it, you lose the ability to be able to truly govern. Now, I do think that you need to make the bureaucracy simple.
Yes.
You need to make what you do very simple, but simple makes complexity work. Complexity does not make complexity work.
And complexity does not make simple work either.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I could have gone into that's a Rubik's cube that we could have gone into there, but yeah, I think, Drum, I think that we have much to learn from each other, and universities have much to learn from good governance in the corporate sector and in the nonprofit sector. By the way, I think that having been, on significant corporate boards for a long period of time, I think that they have something to really learn from the kind of dynamic interaction that occurs in the university board.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think another thing that they can learn is how universities think about the people first versus the profit.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I tell everyone right now, the chief financial officer is not the chief academic officer. The chief academic officer is the one who tells us what we're going to do, and then the chief financial officer's job is to make sure that we have the money to do it. Rather than the other way around. And we're very blessed to not have quarterly reports. We don't have to look at our stock every day. I mean, all those kinds of things. And I think the long view, universities do have a very long view. You talk about the bubble. The bubble started in where did the bubble start? Yeah, it started in Bologna in the year 1200, and we've kind of lived inside that.
That's a big bubble, baby.
Universities and the Catholic Church, here we are, baby. I mean, that's it. But on the other hand, I think the American corporation does not have the kind of long view that, say, the Japanese do, or the Chinese do, or some other cultures do. And I think that very often the drive for profits hurt the issue of culture and opportunity for corporations.
I think you're absolutely right. One of the books that I read years ago, it was almost 30 years ago it came out, it was called The Living Company.
Yeah.
By Ari DeHeis. You're familiar with it?
Yeah. Yes, I am. Absolutely.
Two different kinds of organizations.
Yeah.
The economic company, which is in business to create wealth for a select few, and the living company, which is in business to stay in business, create an environment in which its employees can grow and thrive. Profits are important, but they're not the single most important thing.
And universities are living beings; they really are. And think about it. I mean, what are we made up of? Talent and talent, talent and talent. I mean, we do have the right of other things, but in the end, it's about talent and ideas, and those are sort of ephemeral. Those are not. I can't see the results. Really, the only people in universities who see real results almost immediately is our football coach or our basketball coach. I mean, you can see whether you won or lost, or or some other our hospital stays, or variety of things like that. But universities are so idea-centric that we have to work it that way. We have to do that dance, to use my term again.
I got it. I wish we had way more time because, we both, I think I enjoy talking with you for sure. 3 takeaways for your university presidents on how to deal with boards.
1, love them. 2, communicate with them. And 3, never surprise them.
That was simple.
Yeah, by that I mean, never had them read the newspaper or something that you should have told them. That's a death-defying act, I think.
I don't know if it's defying death. I think it's welcoming it.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
So, and Gordon, what's next for you?
Well, I think what's next for me is to get our university open, figure out how to dance through the coronavirus, and figure out how to thrive. The issue that so many institutions are looking at, how do we hang on? I believe that's the wrong question. The real question is, how do we thrive from what we are learning? And the question that needs to be answered is, how do we reduce costs and increase quality?
Mm-hmm. And how do we create a learning environment differently than we have before that is more relatable to students and to the people who hire our graduates?
Well, we have to become very student-centric. There's no doubt about it. We can no longer talk about teaching loads and research opportunities. Loads sound like it's a miserable moment. Oh my gosh, I have to teach. It's a load. I'm not going to be able to survive. I have to go in there. We got to get over that attitude, right?
Absolutely. And so let's do this again in a couple of months.
Okay, yeah. Next time we can talk about football or something. How does that sound?
We certainly hope that it's playing by then, but no idea how many people are going to be in the stadium.
Me too. Well, I'm going to give everyone a mask and a shot. I don't know what kind of shot.
Well, is it going to be bourbon? Is it going to be Scotch whiskey? I don't know.
It could be that. As a devout Mormon, I'm not opposed to that. But anyway, it's wonderful to talk with you, Drum. Thank you very much.
Likewise, sir. Always a pleasure. Until next time.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Dr. Gordon Gee, president of West Virginia University, and for sharing his insights on higher ed governance and what needs to happen to make it more viable in times of crisis. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Blackbaud. Visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn about their cloud fundraising, accounting, education management, scholarship, and analytics solutions that are powering some of higher ed's top institutions. Our next guest is Dr. Eric Boynton, Provost at Beloit College. Eric joined us from his home to talk about how Beloit is approaching the fall term and how they've uniquely set up the way that the students will be attending classes. This is a great one. You won't want to miss it, folks.
This episode of Changing Higher Ed was brought to you by Blackbaud, the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. Be sure to visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn how they can help your institution deliver a better experience from admissions to advancement. Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show. We would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.